I'm here for you. I know.
She sat her 14-year-old daughter down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in March, and she said the words as gently as she could. "I need to tell you what to watch for," she said. "I saw this happen to someone once. I just didn't know it was going to be me." Her daughter looked back at her, confused, waiting for more. But her mother just held her hand, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. 5 years later, that same woman sat alone in a lawyer's office, signing the last page of her own divorce papers. She thought she was protecting her daughter from a mistake she had already survived once before. She had no idea she was about to make it again. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Sarah Whitman, and in the spring of that year, she believed she had already lived through the hardest lesson of her life. She was 39 years old, raising her daughter Emma alone in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, and she had spent years rebuilding a version of herself that felt safe, steady, and finally free. What Sarah did not know that evening at the kitchen table was that the warning she gave her daughter was not a memory from her past. It was a preview of her own future, one she would not recognize until it was already too late to stop. Sarah believed love was supposed to feel like being chosen above everyone else. She grew up the middle child of three sisters in a small town outside Dayton, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital and a father who left when Sarah was 9 years old. She learned early that stability was something you built for yourself, not something that was simply given to you. And she carried that lesson with a kind of quiet pride into her 20s, believing it made her stronger than most people her age. Sarah's own mother, Diane, had lived through something similar decades earlier, though nobody in the family used words like control or manipulation to describe it at the time. Sarah remembers, as a child, watching her mother call her father at work 3 or 4 times a day, not out of affection, but because Sarah's father had made it clear, in ways never discussed openly at the dinner table, that he expected to know exactly where his wife was and what she was doing at all times. When Sarah's father finally left the family when Sarah was 9, most of the extended family quietly blamed Diane, describing her as difficult, as someone who had driven a good man away with her constant need for reassurance. It would take Sarah more than 3 decades to understand that her mother had not been difficult at all, only exhausted, worn down by years of proving her own innocence for things she had never actually done. Sarah carried a private promise out of that childhood, one she did not fully articulate even to herself until she was much older. She promised she would never let a man make her feel the way her father had made her mother feel, would never spend her adult life explaining herself for imagined offenses, would never let anyone's suspicion shrink the size of her own world. It is a strange and painful irony, Sarah says now, that a person can spend an entire childhood learning exactly what to watch for, build an entire adult identity around never repeating it, and still walk directly into a quieter, gentler version of the very same thing, not once, but twice. At 22, in her final year of college, Sarah met a man named Mark Sullivan at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. He was 26, confident, and already establishing himself in a sales career that had him traveling several days a week. From the very first conversation, Mark had a way of making Sarah feel like the only person in the room, remembering small details she mentioned only once, showing up early to everything, complimenting her intelligence in front of people whose opinions she valued. Her friends told her she was lucky. Her mother told her Mark seemed like the kind of man who would take care of her. Nobody, including Sarah, saw any reason to be cautious. They married a year and a half later, in a small ceremony that Mark's family helped pay for, a detail Sarah would only understand the significance of many years afterward. In the earliest months of the marriage, everything felt exactly the way she had imagined it would. Mark planned surprise dinners. He introduced her to his colleagues as the smartest person he knew. He called her during his business trips just to say goodnight. It was only gradually, so gradually that Sarah could never later point to a single starting moment, that the shape of their relationship began to change into something else entirely. The first shift Sarah remembers clearly happened around their first anniversary, when she mentioned she wanted to apply for a promotion at the marketing firm where she worked, a role that would require 2 out-of-state trips a year. Mark did not tell her not to apply. Instead, he asked a long series of questions over dinner that night about who else would be on those trips, about how long the position would keep her away from home, about whether it was really worth the stress on their marriage so early on. By the end of the conversation, Sarah found herself reassuring him rather than discussing her own excitement about the opportunity, and she did not apply for the promotion that year. Over the following 2 years, similar conversations repeated themselves in different forms, often disguised as concern rather than control. When Sarah wanted to spend a weekend with her college roommate in Chicago, Mark reminded her, gently, how much he missed her when she traveled without him. When she came home later than expected from a work event, he did not raise his voice, but he grew quiet for the rest of the evening, and Sarah learned to fill that silence with apologies before he ever asked for one. She began, without fully realizing it, running her decisions past an internal version of Mark before she made them, calculating in advance which choices would keep the peace and which ones would cost her a difficult night. By the time Sarah turned 28, for years into the marriage, she had stopped mentioning certain friendships altogether, not because Mark had ever forbidden them outright, but because it was simply easier than explaining herself afterward. Her sister Katie noticed first. During a visit that spring, Katie pulled Sarah aside in the kitchen and asked her, carefully, whether everything was all right, because Sarah seemed different lately, quieter, more careful with her words than Katie remembered her being in college. Sarah brushed off the question that day, telling her sister that marriage simply required compromise, that this was what it looked like to build a life with someone. It took another 4 years, and one specific evening in particular, for Sarah to finally admit to herself what her sister had already suspected. Mark had come home upset after a difficult day at work, and over a disagreement about weekend plans that Sarah could no longer even fully remember. He had said something to her that crossed a line neither of them had crossed before, a comment about her intelligence, delivered with a coldness she had never heard from him. He apologized within the hour, blaming stress, promising it would never happen again. And for the first time in 8 years of marriage, Sarah realized she believed the apology far more easily than she believed the promise attached to it. One incident from that period stayed with Sarah for years afterward, one she would later describe to a therapist as the moment she should have understood everything, if only she had known what she was looking at. At her college roommate's wedding, when Sarah was 29, she spent much of the reception catching up with old friends she had not seen in years, laughing freely in a way she realized, only in hindsight, she rarely did anymore. Mark did not say a single word to her about it that night. But on the drive home, he told her, quietly, that he had noticed how much more animated she seemed around her old friends than she ever was with him lately, and asked whether there was something missing between them that he should be worried about. Sarah spent the rest of that week trying to reassure him, canceling a lunch with the same roommate the following month without ever fully explaining why. By the time Sarah finally sat down with a therapist for the first time, 6 months before she left the marriage, she described her relationship with Mark using words like complicated and difficult, careful even then to avoid language that felt too harsh for a man who had never once raised a hand to her. It took several sessions before her therapist gently pointed out that control does not require violence to be real, that a person can spend 8 years slowly disappearing inside a relationship without ever once being shouted at or struck, simply by learning, one small compromise at a time, which parts of themselves were safe to keep and which parts needed to be quietly set aside. Sarah remembers sitting in that office, hearing her own life described back to her in language she had never had access to before, and feeling something inside her finally settle into place. Sarah left Mark Sullivan the following year, at 32 years old, taking with her only what fit into her car and a fierce, hard-won clarity about what she would never allow into her life again. The divorce itself was quieter than she expected, Mark contesting little, perhaps already aware on some level that the version of their marriage he wanted to preserve had ended long before Sarah found the courage to say so out loud. In the aftermath, Sarah did the work that so many people talk about doing, but few actually finish. She went to therapy for nearly 2 years. She read everything she could find about the subtle mechanics of control in relationships. She told her closest friends, more than once, that if she ever saw the same pattern again, in any form, she would recognize it instantly. For years after her divorce from Mark, Sarah met a man named Daniel Cole at a fundraising dinner for Emma's elementary school. where Sarah had volunteered to help organize the silent auction. Daniel was 36, recently divorced himself, with no children of his own, working as a project manager for a construction firm downtown. He was different from Mark in almost every visible way, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of man who listened longer than he spoke. Within their first few conversations that evening, Daniel asked Sarah more questions about Emma's interests than about Sarah herself, and something about that small detail put Sarah immediately at ease in a way she had not expected. Over the following months, Daniel courted Sarah with a patience that felt, to everyone watching, like the opposite of everything she had survived with Mark. He never pressured her to move faster than she was ready for. He asked Emma, then 9 years old, about her favorite books before he ever asked Sarah out on a formal date. When Sarah mentioned, cautiously, some of what she had been through in her first marriage, Daniel listened without interrupting, and afterward told her simply that he was in no hurry, that trust was something built slowly, and that he understood if it took her time to feel safe again. Sarah's friends, who had watched her rebuild herself for years, told her they had never seen her laugh so easily with anyone. One evening early in their relationship stood out to Sarah for a long time afterward as proof that Daniel was different from anyone she had dated since Mark. They had been seeing each other for about 3 months when Sarah mentioned, almost in passing, that she had always wanted to take a solo trip to the coast of Maine, something she had never done because Mark used to describe her interest in traveling alone as strange, even a little concerning for a married woman. When Sarah told Daniel this story over dinner, he did not offer to come along, and he did not ask why she wanted to go by herself. He simply told her that sounded like exactly the kind of trip she should take, and 2 weeks later Sarah found a handwritten card in her bag before she left for the airport, wishing her a wonderful, well-earned week entirely to herself. Sarah kept that card for years, long after she had any real reason to. Sarah's sister Katie remembers meeting Daniel for the first time at a family barbecue that same summer, and pulling Sarah aside afterward, the same way she once had with Mark, though this time with an entirely different kind of question. Katie asked Sarah whether it felt strange, letting herself be treated so gently after everything she had survived, and Sarah admitted that some days it did feel strange, that some part of her kept waiting for the second half of Daniel's kindness to reveal itself, the way it always eventually had with Mark. Katie told her sister that maybe, this time, there simply wasn't a second half to wait for. Both women believed that completely, for years. Sarah and Daniel dated for 2 years before he proposed, a timeline Sarah herself had insisted on, wanting to be certain, wanting Emma to feel secure in the decision as well. They married in a small backyard ceremony 18 months later, with 12-year-old Emma standing beside her mother as maid of honor, reading a short poem she had written herself about second chances. Sarah remembers that day as one of the happiest of her adult life, not because she believed the past no longer mattered, but because she believed, with the kind of certainty only hard-won healing can produce, that she had finally learned to spot the difference between real safety and its imitation. In the early years of their marriage, nothing about life with Daniel resembled what Sarah had escaped with Mark. He cooked dinner most weeknights without being asked. He drove Emma to soccer practice when Sarah's schedule ran late. He remembered that Sarah took her coffee with oat milk, never cream, and made a point of having it ready on the mornings she had early meetings. When Sarah's mother passed away during their second year of marriage, Daniel took 2 weeks off work without hesitation to help Sarah manage the funeral arrangements and to sit with Emma, who was struggling to understand grief for the first time in her young life. Sarah told her sister Katie that year that she finally understood what people meant when they described a partner as a soft place to land. It was somewhere in the 3rd year of the marriage that the smallest shifts began, so quiet at first that Sarah genuinely did not notice them happening, in much the same way she had not noticed the earliest shifts with Mark until years afterward. Daniel began asking, in an easy, conversational tone, who Sarah had been texting when her phone buzzed during dinner, always framing it as simple curiosity rather than suspicion, always following the question with a joke that made it feel impolite for Sarah to react with anything but a laugh. When Sarah mentioned an old college friend she had reconnected with online, Daniel asked, lightly, whether that friendship had ever been anything more than platonic, a question Sarah answered honestly and quickly, telling herself afterward that it was a fair thing for any husband to wonder. The comments about her clothing arrived gradually as well. always wrapped inside compliments that left Sarah second-guessing herself only after Daniel had already left the room. Before a work dinner where Sarah planned to wear a dress she had bought for the occasion, Daniel told her she looked beautiful, and then added that he had always found her more striking in something a little less form-fitting, something that let people focus on her mind rather than her appearance. Sarah changed outfits that evening, telling herself Daniel simply knew her better than anyone, that his opinion came from love rather than control, and it was only years later, reading her own notes back to herself, that she recognized how often that particular pattern repeated itself before important events. When a director position opened at Sarah's firm during their 4th year of marriage, a role Sarah had been working toward for nearly a decade, she came home that evening eager to tell Daniel the news. He congratulated her warmly, told her she deserved it more than anyone else in the building, and then asked, almost as an afterthought, who would be handling her travel arrangements if she took the position, since the role would require quarterly trips to the company's regional offices. It was a small, reasonable-sounding question, the kind any supportive partner might ask about logistics. But Sarah felt something tighten in her chest as she answered it, a feeling she recognized instantly, because she had felt it before, years earlier, with another man, in another kitchen, over another opportunity she had eventually let slip away without ever being told directly to say no. A dinner party that same year offered another small piece of the pattern Sarah would not fully recognize until much later. Hosting colleagues from her firm for the first time since her promotion into a senior role, Sarah had spent the afternoon preparing, excited to finally bring her two worlds together after years of keeping them carefully separate. Partway through the evening, discussing a project she had led that quarter, Sarah noticed Daniel gently redirecting the conversation twice, mentioning a home renovation project instead, complimenting her cooking rather than her work. Her colleagues did not seem to notice anything unusual. Sarah noticed, but told herself afterward that Daniel was simply nervous meeting her co-workers for the first time, that it meant nothing more than that. A family vacation to the Outer Banks the following summer produced a similar moment, one Sarah would later find recorded in her own handwriting when she began going back through old journal entries. Sarah had made plans one afternoon to walk the beach with a woman she had met at the rental house next door, someone she had immediately liked and hoped to spend more time with before the week ended. When she mentioned the plan to Daniel over breakfast, he did not object outright. He simply asked, lightly, whether it made sense to spend their limited vacation time with strangers instead of each other, and reminded her how rare it was for the three of them, Sarah, Daniel, and Emma, to have an entire week together without work getting in the way. Sarah canceled the walk that afternoon and did not think about the exchange again for almost 3 years. Sarah did not apply for the director position that year. She told herself, at the time, that the timing simply was not right, that Emma was entering a difficult stretch of high school and needed more of her attention at home, that there would be other opportunities down the line when circumstances lined up better. It was a familiar kind of reasoning, one Sarah had used before without recognizing where she had learned it, and it would take her nearly a year and a conversation she never expected to have before she understood exactly how familiar that reasoning truly was. Looking back, Emma later told her mother that she had noticed something unusual much earlier than that college weekend, though at 16 she had not yet had the language to describe what she was seeing. During her junior year of high school, Emma remembered a specific afternoon when her mother had been invited, last minute, to join a former colleague for lunch downtown, and had spent nearly 10 minutes on the phone with Daniel beforehand, explaining who the colleague was, how they knew each other, and what time exactly she expected to be home. Emma, doing homework at the kitchen table nearby, had thought nothing of it at the time beyond a vague, unnamed discomfort, the kind teenagers often dismiss as simply not understanding adult relationships yet. It was only years later, replaying that memory alongside dozens of others, that Emma recognized it for what it actually was. It was Emma, home for a long weekend during her freshman year of college, who first said out loud what her mother could not yet fully see in herself. Sitting on the back porch one evening, watching her mother check her phone twice before answering a simple question about weekend plans, Emma finally spoke up. "Mom," she said carefully, "this feels like the thing you told me to watch out for, back when I was 14. Sarah opened her mouth to disagree immediately, the way she always had when Katie asked similar questions years before with Mark. But something in her daughter's voice, calm and certain rather than accusing, made Sarah stop herself before the denial fully left her mouth. That conversation did not change everything overnight, but it planted something in Sarah that she could not fully ignore afterward. Over the following months, she began quietly re-examining moments she had brushed aside for years, the way she once helped friends examine their own relationships from the safety of an outside perspective. She started writing things down in a private folder on her laptop, small entries at first, a comment Daniel had made before a dinner party, a question about her phone that had felt slightly too pointed, the director position she had quietly let go of without ever fully explaining why. Read individually, none of it looked like much. Read together, months later, across nearly 2 years of entries, the pattern became impossible to unsee. Sarah reached out that same season to 2 women she had lost touch with over the years. Women who had known her during her marriage to Mark and had tried, gently, to say something was wrong long before Sarah was ready to hear it. She asked them, carefully, what they remembered seeing from the outside back then, and both women described almost the exact same thing, in almost the exact same words. They told her she had grown quieter at dinners during that marriage, that she used to speak freely about her plans and slowly stopped mentioning them at all, that she had started saying, "I'll have to check," about decisions she once made entirely on her own. Hearing those words again, years later, applied without effort to her marriage with Daniel, made it impossible for Sarah to keep telling herself she was imagining a problem where none existed. One of those 2 women, a former co-worker named Rachel who had stayed close to Sarah through most of her marriage to Mark, offered something else during that conversation, something Sarah had not expected to hear. Rachel told her that in the early months of Sarah's relationship with Daniel, she had actually voiced a small concern to her own husband, mentioning that something about how quickly Daniel had learned Sarah's exact schedule, her exact routines, felt oddly familiar, though Rachel had talked herself out of saying anything to Sarah directly at the time, not wanting to project old fears onto a new relationship that seemed, by every visible measure, to be healthy. Sarah did not blame Rachel for staying silent back then. She understood, better than anyone, how easy it was to see a pattern clearly in someone else's life and still doubt your own eyes when it came to your own. Over the weeks that followed, Sarah began noticing something else as she reread her own journal entries, something that unsettled her more than any single incident on its own. The entries themselves had grown shorter and more careful over the years, the earliest ones full of small complaints and observations written freely, the more recent ones vague, qualified, hedged with phrases like, "probably nothing," and "I'm sure it's fine." Sarah realized she had been editing her own private thoughts for Daniel's comfort long before she ever showed them to anyone else, that even in a locked folder no one else had access to, some part of her had still been managing his reaction in advance. The turning point, when it finally arrived, came on an ordinary Thursday evening, not during an argument, but during a moment of complete quiet at their kitchen table. Sarah had been invited, at last, to speak at a regional conference for her firm, a genuine professional opportunity she had wanted for years and had nearly talked herself out of pursuing it all. When she told Daniel the news that evening, he smiled, congratulated her warmly, and then asked, in the same easy tone he always used, who was organizing her travel and which colleagues would be attending alongside her. Sarah answered him, and then sat with the familiar tightness in her chest for the rest of the evening, finally allowing herself to name it for what it was, rather than explaining it away as she had done so many times before. The conference itself took place 3 weeks later, in Denver, and Sarah remembers standing at the podium in front of nearly 200 people, delivering a presentation she had spent months preparing, feeling a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. Colleagues she barely knew approached her afterward to say how much her talk had resonated with them, how clearly she had explained a topic most people in the room had struggled to understand. On the flight home, Sarah found herself dreading the return more than she was able to admit even to herself, not because she wanted to stay away from her family, but because some part of her already understood that walking back through her own front door meant returning to a smaller version of the woman who had just spent 3 days feeling, for the first time in years, entirely her own. Daniel picked her up from the airport that evening, warm and attentive, asking detailed questions about the conference, about which colleagues she had spent time with, about whether the hotel had been comfortable. Sarah answered every question honestly, and somewhere around the 15th question, driving home in the dark, she realized she was once again mentally reviewing the trip for anything that might sound, to Daniel, like it needed further explanation. She had done nothing wrong. She had nothing to hide. And still, some old, practiced part of her was already preparing its defense before any accusation had even been made. That night, after Daniel had gone to sleep, Sarah sat alone at the same kitchen table where she had once warned her 14-year-old daughter about a pattern from her past. She opened her laptop and read through everything she had written down over the previous months, start to finish, in one uninterrupted sitting for the very first time. By the time she closed the folder, she was no longer asking herself whether she was imagining a problem in her marriage. She was asking herself how long she had already known the truth without letting herself say it out loud, and how many more years she was willing to spend defending a version of safety that had quietly, patiently, become another version of control. Sarah told Emma before she told anyone else, including her sister Katie, including any of her closest friends. She did not frame the conversation as a confession or as a failure on her part. She simply told her daughter the truth, that the man she had believed was nothing like Mark had, in his own quiet way, built many of the same walls, just constructed from entirely different material. Emma did not respond with shock or surprise. She told her mother she had suspected something was wrong for over a year, and that she had been waiting, hoping her mother would arrive at the realization in her own time, rather than being told directly by someone else. That conversation, more than any single moment with Daniel himself, gave Sarah the resolve she needed to finally move forward. Telling Daniel was harder than Sarah had expected, not because she doubted her decision, but because Daniel's reaction was exactly what she should have anticipated by then. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue in the way Mark once had. Instead, he asked calm, careful questions designed to make Sarah doubt the very thing she had spent months writing down and confirming with people who had known her for years. He reminded her how much he had done for Emma, how patient he had been in the early years of their relationship, how unfair it felt to be compared to a man Sarah herself had once called nothing like him. For the first time in either of her marriages, Sarah found herself able to sit with that discomfort without immediately taking responsibility for causing it. Later, piecing together fragments of things Daniel had mentioned over the years about his own first marriage, Sarah began to understand, without ever excusing it, where some of his behavior might have come from. Daniel had described his first wife, briefly and only a handful of times, as someone who had been unfaithful early in their marriage, an experience that had clearly left him with a deep and lasting fear of being betrayed again. Sarah did not doubt that Daniel had been genuinely hurt once, or that his caution had grown out of real pain rather than simple cruelty. But she also understood, more clearly now than she ever had with Mark, that a person's own history does not obligate anyone else to spend their life proving they are different from whoever came before, and that good intentions do not change the actual weight of living inside someone else's unresolved fear, year after year, regardless of where that fear originally came from. Packing up her belongings in the final weeks before she moved out was harder than Sarah expected, not because she doubted her decision, but because of how many ordinary, happy memories were tangled up in the same rooms she was now leaving behind. She found Emma's old school photographs in a drawer in the study, a stack of postcards from her solo trip to Maine, the handwritten card Daniel had left her before that same trip, years earlier, when everything between them had still felt entirely uncomplicated. Sarah kept some of it and left the rest behind, understanding by then that a relationship could contain real tenderness and real harm at the very same time, and that leaving did not require her to pretend the good years had never happened at all. The divorce itself took nearly a year to finalize, slowed by shared finances, a house neither of them wanted to give up without a fight, and Daniel's continued insistence, delivered calmly in every mediation session, that Sarah was overreacting to things that, in his words, had never actually happened the way she remembered them. In one mediation session, Daniel brought up the Outer Banks vacation himself, describing it as simply wanting more family time, genuinely confused as to how that memory could now be used as evidence of anything at all. Sarah found herself, in that moment, feeling something close to sympathy for him, understanding that Daniel likely believed every word he was saying, that he had never once experienced his own behavior the way Sarah had experienced receiving it. That realization, more than any argument either of them made in that room, was what finally convinced Sarah she was making the right decision. Two people could sit across a table from each other, remembering the exact same 8 years, and arrive at entirely different truths, and Sarah no longer needed Daniel to agree with her version in order to trust it. Sarah did not argue the point with him for long. She had already spent 2 decades of her life trying to prove her own perception of reality to men who quietly benefited from her doubting it, and she was no longer interested in winning that particular argument for anyone's benefit but her own. She gathered what she needed, signed what needed to be signed, and eventually walked out of a house that, if she was honest with herself, had never quite belonged to her the way it should have. On the day the divorce was finalized, Sarah did not call her closest friends first, and she did not call her sister Katie, though both would hear the news within the hour. She called Emma, 20 years old by then, sitting in a dorm room 3 states away. She told her daughter it was over, and Emma was quiet for a long moment before saying something Sarah would carry with her for the rest of her life. Emma told her that she had learned more from watching her mother finally leave than she had ever learned from the warning at the kitchen table 6 years earlier. She said the real lesson was never about spotting a pattern early enough to avoid it entirely. It was about what a person chooses to do once they finally see it clearly, no matter how long it takes them to get there. In the first year after the divorce, Sarah rented a small 2-bedroom apartment closer to Katie, choosing the location deliberately so that Emma, home from college on breaks, would always have somewhere familiar to land. She remembers the strange, almost disorienting quiet of those early months, evenings with no one to check in with, weekends with no schedule to negotiate in advance. Friends who had watched her disappear slowly into both marriages told her, carefully, that they had missed her, that certain versions of herself had been absent from their lives for years without any of them fully realizing it until she was back. Sarah found this both comforting and quietly devastating, understanding for the first time just how much of herself had gone unnoticed, even by people who loved her, simply because the loss had happened so gradually. She returned to therapy that same year, this time with a different focus than before, where her sessions after leaving Mark had centered on recognizing control from the outside. Her sessions after leaving Daniel centered on a harder question entirely, one her therapist put to her directly during their second appointment. If Sarah had already known what to look for and still missed it, what exactly needed to change now, so that awareness alone was not the only tool she was relying on? Over many months, Sarah and her therapist worked through what that meant in practice, learning to notice the specific feeling in her body, the tightening in her chest, the moment before she began justifying someone else's behavior to herself, and treating that feeling as information worth trusting immediately, rather than something to explain away first and examine later, if ever. Sarah eventually did apply for a director position 2 years after her divorce from Daniel was finalized, at a different firm entirely. She got the job, and with it, the quarterly travel she had once quietly let slip away twice. First with Mark's discomfort, and later with Daniel's careful questions. She still remembers her first work trip alone in that new role, sitting in an airport terminal with nobody to explain her schedule to, feeling something she did not immediately recognize because it had been so long since she had felt it without complication. It took her most of the flight to name it. It was simply hers, entirely and without qualification, in a way very few things in either marriage had ever fully been. Sarah is 44 years old now, and she is not remarried, though she says this is not out of fear so much as a kind of hard-earned patience she never had access to at 23 or 39. She still lives outside Columbus, closer now to her sister Katie than she has been in years, and she speaks openly, when people ask, about both of her marriages, no longer treating either one as a story to be hidden or softened for the comfort of others. What she is proudest of is not that she eventually left Daniel, but the woman her daughter has become in the years since. Emma, now 23, has ended 2 relationships in her early 20s the moment she recognized the same quiet questions, the same conditional kindness her mother once described, long before either relationship had the chance to take root the way it once did in Sarah's life. The first time it happened, Emma was 21, 3 months into a relationship with a classmate who had begun, gently, asking who she was meeting for coffee between classes. always framed as simple interest rather than suspicion. Emma called her mother that same week, described the conversation almost word for word, and asked Sarah directly whether this was the beginning of the pattern she had spent years describing. Sarah remembers going quiet on the phone for a long moment, recognizing pieces of both of her own marriages in her daughter's description before telling Emma, honestly, that she could not promise her it would get better on its own. Only that Emma now had something Sarah never had at 21, a mother willing to say the hard thing out loud instead of waiting to see how it turned out. Emma ended that relationship within the month. The second time, 2 years later, the signs were quieter still, easy for almost anyone to miss entirely. A boyfriend who complimented Emma's independence constantly, while somehow always finding a reason her career ambitions should wait another year, another semester, another season. Emma recognized it herself this time, without needing to call her mother first, and told Sarah about it only after the relationship had already ended, almost as an afterthought during a Sunday phone call. Sarah says that phone call, more than any single moment from either of her own marriages, is what finally allowed her to believe that some patterns, even ones passed down without meaning to, could still be broken by the very next generation, one honest conversation at a time. Looking back now, Sarah says the hardest part was never recognizing a pattern in someone else's story. She had done that easily for years, sitting across from friends, nodding along as they described relationships she could see clearly from the outside looking in. The hardest part was accepting that a lesson learned once, even a lesson learned through genuine pain and years of deliberate work, does not automatically protect a person from learning that same lesson a second time, in a different shape, wearing a quieter, gentler face. Awareness, she says now, was never the finish line she once believed it to be. It was only the beginning of a much longer, much harder kind of honesty, one that requires a person to turn that same clear-eyed attention back onto their own life while it is still happening to them, not years later, once it has already become a story worth telling. On the anniversary of her divorce from Daniel each year, Sarah and Emma have a standing tradition now, a simple dinner at the same small Italian restaurant where they first celebrated Emma's high school graduation. They do not spend the evening discussing either marriage in detail anymore. Mostly they talk about Emma's job, her friends, the small, ordinary details of two lives that have both, in their own separate ways, grown steadier with time. But every year, before dessert arrives, one of them brings up the kitchen table conversation from years ago, the one where Sarah first warned her daughter about a pattern she thought belonged entirely to her past. And they sit with it together for a moment, not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of shared understanding that only the two of them fully carry. Sarah's sister Katie says she still thinks often about that first conversation on the porch years ago, when she asked Sarah whether everything was all right during the marriage to Mark, and Sarah brushed the question aside. Katie says she used to wonder what might have happened if she had pushed harder that day, asked a second question instead of letting it go. Sarah has told her, more than once, that it would not have mattered, that she was not ready to hear it then no matter how it was asked, and that the only thing that ever truly worked, both for herself and later for Emma, was staying close enough and patient enough to still be standing there when the person finally was ready to see it for themselves. That, in the end, is the part of Sarah's story she hopes people remember most, more than the two marriages, more than the years of quiet compromise, more than the folder of journal entries that finally convinced her to leave. Not everyone recognizes a pattern the moment it enters their life, no matter how many times they have survived it before, no matter how much they have read or healed or promised themselves. But the people who stay close, who ask the second question, who are still there when someone finally opens their eyes, those are the ones who make it possible to walk away at all. So we will leave you with the same question Sarah still asks herself today. Have you ever recognized a pattern so clearly in someone else's life, only to find yourself standing inside that very same pattern years later, unable to see it until someone else was finally the one to point it out to you? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Sarah's position, and whether you believe awareness alone is ever truly enough to protect any of us from repeating our own history. If this story moved you, stay with us, because next week we are bringing you another true story about the moments that quietly change the entire course of a person's life. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story like Sarah's today, share this video with them before you go.